Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Nemat Shafik, who is Vice President for Private Sector Development, Infrastructure, and Guarantees at the World Bank. Dr. Shafik, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Egypt, and when you live in a poor country, you're surrounded by poverty, and so that is kind of a natural interest, and the kind of question as to why some people have and other people don't is always there. I guess the particular angle that I have on development comes from the fact that my family was nationalized, and when that occurred, I left as a child and was raised in the U.S. as a child and didn't go back to Egypt until I was a teenager. But that experience of nationalization and struggling with the role of the state, trying to take resources to redistribute them, but at the same time not being very successful at it, was a big part of my childhood.
Then were you educated?
As a child in the U.S., but graduate school was all in England.
And you did a doctorate at Oxford, and what did you do your doctorate on? Well,
funnily enough, I did it on the role of the private sector and the public sector in Egypt. And so I was in some ways going back to that childhood formative question, and I actually went and did some high-tech econometric work, which was kind of necessary to fulfill the requirements of a doctorate, but also spent time visiting 100 firms and actually going into factories and companies and trying to understand what was it that made the private sector decide to invest, and what determined how they operated and how they saw the government.
Mm-hmm. And these firms were in what country? Or?
All in Egypt.
All in Egypt. Mm-hmm. Oh, so you actually went back to study, actually. You taught briefly, right, at Wharton, but then you went into the World Bank. Talk a little about that choice.
That choice was something that has I've struggled with all along. I've always had one foot in academia, one foot in more operational and policy work. I taught at Georgetown for 6 years. I taught at Wharton, often in parallel to working at the World Bank. So I was literally straddling the fence on a daily basis. I love the teaching, and in some ways that was my mother's side because of the immediacy of seeing students learn and how gratifying that was. But I also loved systemic change, and doing things that were operational and policy related meant that you could change whole systems rather than changing the lives of a few individuals. And so I went back and forth, and I did both until about 2 years ago, when I took on this job where the managerial responsibilities were so vast that there was really no way that I could continue to teach and do this job. So I've kind of hung my hat on the systemic change hook.
The World Bank is one of the outstanding international institutions created in the post-World War II world, but it's had to change its mission as the world has changed, and especially after the collapse of communism and the emergence of a post-Cold War world. The problems were seen from different lenses. Talk a little about that and how that fits into your portfolio, namely a kind of a different perspective on the private sector's role in development.
No, the origins of the World Bank were really in post-war reconstruction. Many people forget that our first loan was actually to France, and it was very much oriented toward major public sector infrastructure projects, which were basically to rebuild war-torn economies. We've come such a long way, really, since then. We now don't lend to the industrial countries and really only lend to the developing countries. And we still finance infrastructure, and infrastructure is actually a big part of my portfolio. We do still about $6 billion of infrastructure lending every year.
Explain what infrastructure means to
Sure.
our audience that might not know that. Yeah.
Sure. Infrastructure is really it's funny, in Arabic the word for infrastructure is the foundation. It's the foundation of an economy. It's water, power, transport, roads, bridges, ports, all the stuff that underlies economic activity and makes it possible. And in the past, virtually all of that work was done and financed by the public sector. But I think, as you implied, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also with the kind of revolution in thinking and economics, we suddenly realized that so much of our activity could actually be financed by the private sector, and in many ways better managed by the private sector. It started off with manufacturing. In many developing countries, even the most basic things like the production of garments and food was done by state-owned enterprises. And the early to mid-'80s was a time when we began thinking about privatizing those enterprises because many of them were so inefficient. But the privatization revolution then extended beyond just manufacturing and moved towards sectors like infrastructure, and increasingly things like water and power, roads are being provided by the private sector, as we've realized that they're sometimes more efficient, very often more efficient, and also, frankly, have much greater financial resources than the public sector.
And there's a third phase now in what I read, namely you're even going beyond that to look at privatization of public services like health and education.
It's true, and it's come again with the realization that if we neglect that issue, we're not doing justice to development. We found that in some of the poorest parts of Africa, 80% of the population gets its health services from the private sector, from small clinics, local doctors. And here when I talk about the private sector, I'm not talking about the big multinationals, I'm talking about small businesses, farms, that kind of thing. And so we realized that unless we started to think creatively about how to improve the quality of services that those small providers of midwives, small local private health clinics provided, we would be missing a huge part of the health needs of the poor.
So how do you reach this, the sector that you're talking about? Obviously, if it's a big company, they're easier to find. But if you're talking about association of midwives or health facilities at the local level, what is the intermediary, or is there one, or do you deal directly with them?
Well, it varies. I can give you two examples, one in the electricity sector and one in the health sector. In electricity, say in a country like Yemen, we found that it was virtually impossible. It's a highly mountainous country, a bit like Afghanistan, highly mountainous, very isolated communities. There was no way that the government could have an electricity grid to provide electricity to all these poor communities. And so what the government did, quite wisely, was to have free entry and said anybody who wants to buy a power generator and set up a wire and sell to his neighbors can do that. And so now Yemen has a penetration rate of 75%. It means 75% of the population of this country, where per capita income is only $200 per capita, have access to electricity. Typically, in most parts of Africa with similar level of development, only 25% have access. So simply by allowing free entry, by saying small providers can enter the market, it's not forbidden, you don't have to be plugged into the utility, that alone was enough to make this possible.
You said there was a second example.
Yeah, in the health sector, for example, what we've been trying to do to reach some of these smaller scale providers is we saw a very interesting example in Bangladesh. We didn't do it, a local NGO in Bangladesh did it, called BRAC. And they wanted to find ways, children die of diarrhea all the time in Bangladesh, and they wanted to find ways to teach mothers how to give children who had diarrhea oral rehydration salts, basically a saline solution which enabled them to recover. So the NGO actually had these extension workers, these women who went out, midwife type women who went out and taught mothers how to use this stuff. What they did, which was very clever, was they said, we'll pay you, these private providers, not for every household you visit, but we're going to go back after you visit these households and test whether the mother knows how to mix the solution. And we'll actually physically test the solution and watch her do it. And by doing it this way, they actually increased the ability of the mothers to actually give the medicine properly and reduce the rate of infant mortality very dramatically. But didn't do it through a traditional way of having a public sector, using the local Ministry of Health, and they did it with this, using these private providers, but also having it very incentive-based. So it was in the incentive of these midwives to make sure that the mothers didn't just hear them, but actually learned.
So then, what is the role of government, and what is your relationship to government now as you move in this direction?
Well, you're quite right. It changes it. The role of government becomes one of regulating and setting the rules, and also still financing, because for these midwives to go out and actually teach the mothers how to use this new medicine, someone had to actually pay them an amount. And so the government can still provide a role in financing the services, but they don't necessarily have to actually employ the workers who deliver the services.
And other roles for government? I mean, is clearly there is in many of these countries a problem of corruption. When you're talking about corruption, is government part of the problem, or can it be made part of the solution because of its relationship with you?
Well, corruption takes two to tango, so to speak, in corruption. And government is often one side of the problem, and usually the private sector is on the other side. I think we're actually tackling corruption much more frontally than ever before. We now have anti-corruption programs in about 90 countries, and they focus. I think what we've learned is that to tackle the problem of corruption, it's multidimensional, and it's a cliche to say, but I'll give you real examples. The big money tends to be lost in public procurement, big public contracts that get padded and money exchanges hands. So one of the biggest and most important things we can do to solve corruption is to help governments run public procurement on a competitive and transparent basis. So we've been doing that. It sounds incredibly boring. It's incredibly important for eliminating corruption. But it also takes other forces in society. So one of the things we've been doing is training investigative journalists. Because unless you've got investigative journalists watching both the public and private sectors, corruption doesn't get revealed. We've also found that competition is a very good way to get rid of corruption, because monopolies tend to be very corrupt. So by sort of liberalizing telecommunications or electricity markets, for example, then those providers of those services can't ration the services and get extra funds. And then, of course, decent public salaries. And that's a really tough one, because if the tax collector's underpaid, he has a huge incentive to extract something from you so that he doesn't report you to his bosses. And so we've had a harder time with successful civil service reform, because it's so deeply political. But until we resolve that issue of decently paid civil servants, that's always a vulnerability.
So it sounds to me like you're saying that the World Bank's mission is really to set up a creative dynamic between the newly energized private sector, government, but then you've just spoken of the civil society, basically. Absolutely. So it's really all three.
Absolutely. And that's a really new way of working for us. And it's come from an appreciation of both the complexity of the development process and also an appreciation of how vast the resources are that are needed. I mean, we are considered a big global player. We lend roughly $20 billion a year, more or less. Last year, which was not a big year for private investment in developing countries, but still, last year, private investment in developing countries was $250 billion. That's many times more than what we provide. All of aid to the developing world is about $50 billion when you take all the countries that give aid in the world. That's really a drop in the bucket. So unless the resources of the private sector and the energies and talents of civil society are brought to bear on the problem, we're never going to really solve the problem of poverty.
How does the World Bank itself adapt as the world changes, new problems emerges? What is the key to its changing its perspective?
It's partly a function of the business. We see what's happening. What are our clients demanding of us? What are countries asking for? In the olden days, developing countries would come to us and say, help us build schools and dams. Today they're asking us things like, how do we become a knowledge economy? Very different question. Right. And so then we have to figure out, how do we answer that question? The other way we adapt is leadership from our shareholders, and they have views about what we should be focusing on. So some of the issues that are on our agenda now have been pushed by some of our shareholders, issues of global warming, HIV, that kind of thing.
And by shareholders, you mean countries, right?
Countries,
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then our critics. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. But I think our critics have played a very useful role in forcing us to move in different directions, to be more open, and to tackle new issues. When we're trying, in a nutshell, to define your mission, it's really to address the problems of inequality and poverty in the world. And the Arab world is where you are from is a case in point of the kind of problems. I know you've focused on the role of technology in the history of the Arab world and the extent to which
the Arab world lost at that game. In other words, did not match the efforts of other countries. Talk a little about that and your perspective and how it's changed over time on that problem.
The Arab world is in some ways burdened by a history of enormous technological and economic success in the past. And I think part of the malaise in the current period is a sort of bitterness about having lost that. In some ways, one of the biggest, I've come to believe actually, problems that the region faces is that the fact that it does have oil. And that the existence of that oil has enabled countries to actually get by simply extracting resources from the ground rather than having to tap the talents and energies of their population. And so the creation of new knowledge, the creation of new technologies, innovation in terms of production have taken a back seat to the redistribution of oil rents, which has become the mainstay of many of those economies.
And at the heart of your argument in your works that I've read is the argument that a society, a world, has to be transformed by the introduction of technology. Its politics has to change, its economic institution, its legal system, its society. And if that doesn't happen, then it'll get further and further behind, even though, you know, its trade balance might look good because it has a commodity like oil.
No, I think that's quite true. I think that's quite true. And the kind of openness to the outside, in terms of openness to ideas, but also to competitive forces that you need to have a society which is able to effectively use technology, has not been there for many countries in the region. They still tend to be fairly closed, both economically, but also in some ways politically. That's changing. One's beginning to see signs of a free press in certain parts of the region. The internet is a real conundrum, actually, because that's breaking open lots of barriers and taboos. But economically, there's still it's still fairly controlled and restricted, and so that we're not seeing yet the kind of dynamism on the economic side that one would want to.
So that you don't get the pillars of the new world, free markets, liberalization, and democratization. If those two things don't go together, then you get underdevelopment. Now, you've pointed out that the Arab world has done pretty well at training the future generation in technology and various skills, but there's really a problem of deployment of those resources. Tell us about that.
Yeah, no, it's a great paradox, actually, because almost no other region of the developing world has spent as much on education as the Arab world. And so they've made a huge leapfrog in terms of educational attainment levels in a fairly short period of time, which is a fantastic thing. On the other hand, because the labor markets have been so distorted, and so people don't actually get rewarded for being the most productive, those talents haven't been used as effectively as they might. And so graduates from many good universities in the region would rather wait for a civil service job in the government, which will be paid for by rents and revenues of the state, rather than going out and being entrepreneurial and doing something outside the public sector. And that has held back a lot of economic gains in the region.
You also suggest that actually throughout the history that part of this failure to reach the next plateau is related to military expenditures, to the emphasis on national security issues, to external threats, which allow the state to then not move to the next level in transforming the society.
Very true. I mean, military spending in that part of the world is higher than anywhere else as a share of GDP. And that eats up resources that could go elsewhere. Perhaps even more troubling, though, is the consequences of that perpetual fear of conflict, be it regional or internal in many cases, has had a huge negative effect on investment. So private investors, both domestic and foreign, are very reluctant to put to bank on the future of this region. So the investments that are made tend to be short-term and expedient, and no one's really willing to commit to the long term because of that perpetual fear of political instability. And in some ways that has imposed an even greater burden on the region than the mere dollars going out, not mere, but significant dollars going out to be spent on military hardware.
What is your perspective on how terrorism fits into this equation? Because it seems to follow logically that if people can't find the roles that a modern society would define for them, given their education, that they could fall into the various kinds of traps of that terrorism being one. Is that too simple, or?
Well, it's tough. It's tempting to think that, but I've struggled with this because one encounters terrorism in fairly rich and open societies like Italy or the UK or France and Germany, and so and those are all places that have open economies, democratic institutions, and long traditions of tolerance of opposition, and yet you have terrorist groups operating in those countries. So I think it's not so simple. I think, though, what economic stagnation and political authoritarianism do create is not so much the terrorists, but the fertile ground on which terrorist seeds can flourish. So it's not, you'll always have individuals who will have extreme views. But what's really troubling in the region is that there's actually quite a broad base of society which has some sympathy for the terrorists, not so much because they approve of their methods, but it's a form of protesting against a system which is not delivering for them on the economic or the political front.
So how does that argument help you rethink the agenda of the World Bank, or does it? I mean, does it just confirm what you're doing?
Well, in some ways it makes what we do even more important, because unless the world economy can deliver for everybody in the world, we're going to have these kinds of tensions. We recently did a study of the impact of globalization, and it was quite striking. What we found were that countries that had globalized, that had opened themselves up to the world and had increased their share of trade over the last 20 years, grew on average income per capita grew by 5% a year over the last 20 years, which is phenomenal gains. And those countries that had globalized represented 3 billion of the world's population. But on the other hand, those that hadn't integrated with the rest of the world, who represented 2 billion of the world's population, had seen their per capita incomes decline by 1% every year. And in some ways, that's a wonderful testimony to say, you integrate with the world, you're so much better off. On the other hand, it also tells us there are 2 billion people who are worse off today than they were 20 years ago. And unless we solve that, unless we address that, I think it won't be so much the issue of terrorism, but that there are many, many global issues, be it HIV, be it global warming, where there will be international spillovers, and the world will not be safe. And I think institutions like the World Bank have a critical role to play in making the world system fairer for those who are not benefiting today.
In one of the articles that you wrote about the Arab world, you concluded by saying all countries retain the potential power to shape their own future. Is that a philosophy that guides you generally in your work? Because it sounds like it is very relevant to the story you've told us about the work you're doing and how you came to the work.
Yeah, I guess I'm not fatalistic. I actually think that we have a lot of influence over our own destinies, and I think certainly in my personal life I've experienced that, but I think also in my professional life, I think one of the most remarkable things about the 20th century is that one has actually seen countries defeat poverty. When Great Britain industrialized, it took them 350 years to double their per capita income. In the 20th century, countries like Japan, Botswana, Chile have doubled per capita incomes in a decade, in just 10 years. And countries like China in the 1960, 80% of the population lived on less than $1 a day. Today, less than 12%. And so what we've learned is that eliminating poverty, or at least dramatically reducing poverty, is very possible. And I think it's that hope that guides me in feeling that countries actually do have a lot of control over their destinies, and even countries which people thought would be backwaters, such as Hong Kong, are actually able to define a path which is actually quite prosperous.
And another piece of this is that multilateral institutions like the World Bank can play a decisive role in creatively intervening, or that may not be the right word, supporting efforts in this regard.
I think that's right, and I think we do that by supporting and being catalytic. Mm-hmm. I think many people think we're a lot more powerful than we are, and we don't run the world and we don't run countries. But we can certainly play an incredibly important role, because I think part of the reason that Britain took 350 years to double its per capita income was because it was the first one. Part of the reason Japan or Chile or Botswana could do it faster was that they were able to access the technology and the knowledge of predecessors. And what we can do by moving knowledge about what's the best way to reform your telecommunications system, or what is the best latest thinking in terms of education sector reform, by moving that kind of knowledge around the world, we can help countries who are behind catch up much more quickly. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways that's the most powerful role we play.
And it seems that individuals like yourself who come from a country still identify with it, but have moved beyond it, so to speak, sort of inform that kind of international agenda by, in a way, identifying with your origins. Is that a fair statement?
It's true. It's true. I mean, I think for me that image of straddling fences has been a common theme in my life, and being able to understand the perspective of people who are in countries that are not as well off helps a lot in informing my judgments about the work we do at the World Bank.
If students saw this interview, how would you advise them to prepare for a future in which international organizations like the World Bank are going to be important, but in which also nation states are not going to go away?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we're in a very funny period, because with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War system, the world is struggling to define a governance structure for the world. I mean, we have a world economy, we don't have a world government, and we probably won't have a world government. And instead, what we have is this kind of hodgepodge of international institutions like the World Bank, but also the World Trade Organization, the Basel Committee for International Banking Standards, all kind of focused on different parts of the world economy. But we also have very powerful civil society organizations which are operating at the global scale, be it Greenpeace or the international labor unions, who are also operating and shaping the rules of the international game. And so I guess I would tell a student to be prepared for a messy world. There won't be simple systems whereby, like the UN, you have one country, one vote, nation states are represented, and that's the system which runs the world. It's actually going to be a world where there'll be nation states who are players, international organizations that are players, civil society groups and NGOs, and also business associations and voluntary associations of networks that will play a critical role in shaping the future of the world.
Well, Nemat, I regret to say that our time has run out, but thank you very much for joining us for this very interesting conversation about the World Bank and its role in a world that's really changing quite a bit. Thank you.
Thank you.